So to get started, the primary objective for this session is we are going to talk about the legislations and future implications of marijuana through a business perspective. So with that being said, I do want to say that we have not formally taken a stand in support or in opposition of the marijuana issue too. But moving forward, I would like to introduce our speakers. I have Karen Pierce. She is with us today. Karen is the former director of Working Partners, but she now serves as the senior consultant for the new Working Partners team. So I'm very grateful to have her and have access to the wealth of knowledge that she brings with 30 years, over 30 years of experience in this industry. So it's very nice to have her. I then want to introduce Mariah Hinton. Mariah is an attorney associate with Equus Law Group, where she specializes in business law as well as adoption and estate planning. And Mariah has actually just recently joined the Working Partners team, where she will continue to provide her legal expertise to our client base. So Mariah, you feel free to take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Brandy. Yes, so we're going to be talking today, and there's several different breakout sessions that we're going to be talking more about the issue of marijuana. But what we are starting out with, and what I'm starting out with, is a little bit of what is actually in the legislation, because unfortunately, many of us, myself included, don't always know what truly isn't an issue that we're voting on. And for all of us, this could become reality next Tuesday. So it's nice to know and look into what the statute would actually be saying. And so that's where I'm starting at. And obviously, I don't intend to bore anyone. I'm not going to present the whole statute. That's impossible. It's going to be quite long. But we're going to pick out some of the relevant parts here at the beginning, my part, and talk about things. And because, again, if this is passed, it's going to affect all of us in some way. So I'm going to start with kind of the background, the just overview of some of the actual statute, and that will help lead us into, as employers, then what we can expect of this if it becomes reality next Tuesday. So currently, just wanted to touch on a little bit of what the current basis is. As you probably know, medical use of cannabis is permitted, so there has to be a medical use card. And I'm not going to go too much into detail because this is just the standard and giving a little background of where we are currently. There are restrictions, obviously, against recreational use right now. It's a criminal offense under Ohio law currently. And then the current situation is that it doesn't protect an employer's authority to refuse to hire or create a policy or terminate employment for use of marijuana. Obviously, right now, it's all within that. And you'll see that that part specifically, we're going to go through and pull up the statute, is going to be similar. The medical use marijuana statute and what is proposed for employers is pretty similar. So it's still going to give the employers authority to make those decisions, but we still have to consider it within the greater implications of what this could mean for us all if any individual is able to use marijuana recreationally. So that's why we want to go into it again and provide that overview. But then the current situation does protect employers against legal action, obviously, if they are not permitting marijuana. Okay, so just brief overview of what is proposed. Issue 2, and I know this is smaller than what can be read well, so I'll read through the parts that are relevant here. It's going to create, or it would create, if passed, 38 new sections of the revised code. So it's not a small statute. It's going to be pretty lengthy. It is going to be requiring state agencies to create new regulations to implement the various laws. But of course, with every new program or law, we do need to think about how long is it going to take these agencies to catch up and make sure that regulations are properly following what they need to make this effective. The Ohio Department of Commerce would then be regulating those who need to have a license to grow, process, or sell marijuana. So they are wanting to obviously legalize it for recreational use, tax it. Proponents of the bill are saying that it would be a big revenue generator for the state of Ohio. It does not repeal existing criminal prohibitions against marijuana cultivation, but it basically just says that if it's passed, it would create protections against prosecution for those who are using marijuana. Okay, so we wanted to go through what the statute would say about home grow. This might come up some when Karen speaks next as well, so we wanted to lay this groundwork because, again, as employers and HR and in that, what we have to consider and think about is if this is recreational use, what is it going to mean for maybe none of my current employees have a medical use marijuana card, but maybe now some of them start to use it recreationally, or a new employees, it becomes harder to find those who aren't using it. So it's something that is going to be relevant to us is something called home grow. Okay, so what it's saying is under this is part of the statute, so if it passes Tuesday, this is all going to pass as well. So it's not an either or that certain parts of this bill are passing. It would be all of it if it is passed. Okay, so any person over the age of 21 in Ohio would be able to cultivate, grow, and possess not more than 6 cannabis plants at their primary residence. All right, and this is the only restrictions that they would have. Okay? There can't be more than 12 plants at a single residence, even though there might be many, like if there are 4 adults over 21 at a presence at one home, they don't get each of them 6 plants. A multitude, that would be too many for the law. It would be at least no more than 12. But still, that seems like a lot for the ability at any residence, okay? There is this restriction. They're trying to protect against kids from getting it, okay? So this is their alternative to that. Cultivation or growing of adult use cannabis must only take place within a secured closet, room, greenhouse, or other enclosed area, which prevents access to anyone under 21, and it can't be visible by normal unaided vision from a public space. Now, me as a lawyer, just from a personal and privacy constitutional standpoint, I'm asking, so is somebody going to be going to everybody's house to see if they're properly growing these plants? Probably not. That's kind of a separate issue. But this is the restriction, and there isn't more details about who exactly is going to make sure that anybody that has home grow is properly doing that, and it does cause me some concern from a public policy standpoint and talking about minors. It continues. These are other things that would be permissible under home grow, so that any individual could do without having to have a card, without having to have a license. Anybody you work with, any employee could potentially be able to have this home grow in their home. They would be able to process by manual or mechanical means adult use cannabis grown. So obviously they could grow the plant, but they can also do what they want. They can make special brownies or cookies. Again, my concern is what if a kid finds a cookie that they think is a normal chocolate chip cookie and it's not a chocolate chip cookie, okay? But again, for our purposes of employment and everything, that is more of a tangent. They can transfer up to 6 plants to adult use consumer, but they cannot be paid for it and not advertise or promote to the public. So you want to give 3 plants to your sister, you can do that. They can store the cannabis then at their premises if it was purchased from adult use dispensary, of course. Then the limitations against that. You can't use the home grow exception to grow these 6 plants at anywhere other than your primary residence. Can't let anybody less than 21 use it, cultivate it, transfer it. Can't process it by hydrocarbon-based extraction or sell or profit from it. How are they going to police that? Not quite sure, but that's what they say. Okay, maybe some of you are also landlords or know somebody who is a landlord, and a good exception at least is that a landlord can prohibit home grow as long as it's in the lease agreement. So that is wise. that they included that. So the Division of Cannabis Control will set forth additional penalties. So if somebody is found to be in a violation, they have 8 plants in their residence, there will be probably a fine they have to pay, okay, for whatever that's worth. And then if they have double the maximum number of cannabis plants, so if they have 12 instead of 6, not just 8 instead of 6, but 12 instead of 6, then they would be guilty under the statute of the illegal trafficking in drugs or illegal manufacture of drugs. Will this be enough fear in somebody's heart to not do more than that? Probably not. But that's that's what the law is going to be stating as far as restrictions. A question that can come up, because if this is passed, any person over 21 could have these plants in their residence and be using them. So then we're wondering, well, how potent can these be? Do they have restrictions on potency? Just in general, I found this quote from Fran Gerberg, an executive director of Prevention Action Alliance. So obviously she is going to be speaking more so from against the statute, but she's saying THC from cannabis is an addictive substance. Knowing that the potency of THC has increased from 4% in 95 to almost 95 or 98% in some products today is very concerning, because obviously the higher the potency, the more at risk people are of developing addiction. So all that I could find in reviewing the code is this subsection, C21, establishes this THC content limit for adult use cannabis. It limits plant material. The content limit will be no less than 35%, and then for extracts, 90%, unless the division increases or eliminates that threshold. This doesn't state anywhere that it applies to home grow. So possibly somebody who is growing it in their own home is going to be more potent, because nobody is looking at that. There's no requirement to have an agency check out the materials that you've harvested or extracted in your own home. So it's still possible you could have an employee coming in who has been making stuff at their own home, and it could be even more potent than something that they would buy at a store or a dispensary. Okay, so now we're on to the employer's rights. And like I had said, these are very similar, if not basically the same as what is currently provided under the statute for medical use marijuana. We just have to look at this and this will be a later presentation too. We're going to talk, or the speakers are going to have more of some action steps from what I understand, but this is just looking at what does the law say, and it doesn't go into details then of course, enforcing it or making sure that your employees are properly using any home grow statute exceptions. Okay, but nothing in the chapter requires an employer to permit or accommodate an employee's use, possession, or distribution of adult use cannabis, otherwise in compliance with this chapter. So this is saying an employer does not have to permit an employee to use or possess or distribute adult use cannabis. You can set that policy in your workplace that is not allowed. Nothing prohibits an employer from refusing to hire, discharging, disciplining, or otherwise taking an adverse employment action against an individual because of their use, possession, or distribution of cannabis that would otherwise be allowed under the statute. So again, your employment can still say this person, they're using marijuana or they test positive for it, we do not want to hire them, or we're going to let go of them. Nothing prohibits an employer from doing that and making that standard. An employer can also still establish and enforce a drug testing policy, drug-free workplace policy, or a zero-tolerance drug policy, including cannabis. And then it doesn't interfere with federal restrictions on employment. So obviously already there are strict requirements under ODOT and other federal regulations not allowing the use of cannabis and other drugs. And so that's not going to change. So if your place of employment is governed by any agency that already has those restrictions in place, that's not going to change from a legal and requirement standpoint. there's still going to have to be some decisions made from a public policy standpoint and how you are approaching this issue and whether it's going to be harder to find employees, but from these regulation standpoint. Again, this statute protecting employers, it does not permit an individual to basically commence an action against the employer for refusing to hire them or discharging them. So it's protecting to, if you do let go of somebody because they were using marijuana in the workplace and you have said that is not permissible, then you cannot, the law protects the individual from going against you then. It doesn't affect the authority of workers' compensation in Ohio to grant rebates or discounts for employers that participate in a drug-free workplace. That's already established. It's not going to change that ability or authority of the Workers' Compensation Bureau to do that. And then this kind of goes along with subsection 5, just stating that if somebody was discharged from employment because of using cannabis when that has been made known that that's not accepted in the workplace, is not going to be, or it will be considered just cause. So just a little bit, this isn't the statute per se, but just a little bit of some of the effects we already talked about a little bit, but the summary of if issue 2 passes, issue 2 would permit adults 21 years and older to use, possess, and transport marijuana that was legally obtained in the state. It would be permissions to transfer to another adult as long as it's without compensation, which we talked about. This is just kind of a summary. If purchasing at a dispensary, they would have to show ID that they're 21. It's again, 6 cannabis plants per individual, up to 12 at a resident if there's more than one adult over 21. And then they're still prohibited from operating vehicles while under the influence of marijuana. Obviously, hopefully, that would be something that they would put in the law, of course. So you still cannot drive while under the influence of marijuana. And then still, individuals under 21 cannot have access to it, and if somebody presents a false identification, like for alcohol, they would be responsible, there would be criminal violations against them. So for businesses, just a summary of a business's obligations. The Department of Commerce will be the one regulating who can and can't use, like they can still create their own procedures and policies regarding cannabis, and we'll go into more, and they should go into more detail about that. Businesses, like we said on one of the last slides, are still permitted to have drug policies in place that promote a safe working environment, can still create hiring and employment policies related to marijuana use. I would say this is a good time, if you don't have anything in place, to think about that and making a written policy. Obviously, working partners who is here, that is what they do. But if you don't have anything, this is a great time to at least evaluate that, because if this passes, there's going to be, at some point in the future, you're going to run into either a current employee or a possible new hire that uses it recreational, and that you find out like they get a negative drug test and it's test positive for THC content. So this is a good time to start having those questions in the workplace and figuring out what those policies will be. And then again, like we said, an employer can terminate an employee who uses or possesses marijuana, prevent from using them, etc. Can refuse to hire somebody. So that's still the right of an employer. So these are just some considerations, and I think a later presentation will go into some more thoughts on this. But just for my section that I'm just kind of leaving you with to think about is, as an HR or leader of your office, or somebody who just works with other employers, do I want to employ individuals who use marijuana recreationally? Will it be difficult to find employees who do not use recreationally? Maybe not now, but in 5 years. If permitted, what conditions will you have for a recreational user to work while exercising their right to use? Will you say at work you can't test positive at all? Will there be certain levels that are in place? Karen and I have talked about how there's not a lot of research yet about the
I'm going to talk about
what
that.
level. Yeah, she's going to go into more detail about like how we do or do not figure out whether somebody is really under the influence of marijuana and just the lack of stuff out there about that. Will I create written guidelines for employees that honor recreational users' right to use while ensuring safety, productivity, and profitability of the business? And will our place of employment institute a drug-free workplace policy or a zero tolerance policy or any other policy related to the use of cannabis? Okay, so that's what I have for you. And do you want the, do yours Karen again, or I can just hand this over to her? Okay,
Yeah, we can
thank you.
transition over to Karen.
Thank you.
Good job. Good job, Mariah.
Thank you. Will you give me 5 minutes? Like,
Yeah.
tell me when I have 5 minutes?
You have it.
You see these gray hairs? It's because I've never talked about weed so much in my in my 32 years working with businesses as I have the past couple of years. Honest to goodness. Working Partners does policy development, and recently we've been doing a ton of consultation with employers who are saying, okay, I want to stay safe, but I need to find people. How do I balance? And this is with just medical on the books, and not just medical on the books, but just people are using more, which I'm going to show you in a minute. How do I balance being safe and being productive and being able to hire people? So we're spending a lot of time saying, okay, what are the options? You don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't have to like stop testing and not have a drug-free program. But how do you balance things? How do we deal with this? And how do we get real honest about what are our priorities? Do I care more about hiring than I do safety? And sometimes we kind of have to roll up our sleeves and kind of look at some of those things because we are in a tough spot right now. It is like a bowl of yuck. And we're going to come out the other end, and it's going to be much easier to deal with later. But people expected us to deal with medical marijuana like a prescription. You can't, because it's not one. People expect us to use marijuana like alcohol. We can't, because it doesn't have the same research or regulations behind it or facts that we know about it. And I think employers, so that's the only glasses I wear right now, I think employers, you have it rough. This is a very difficult issue. And it is going to get, and it is going to get easier, but it's going to be a little while. So I think the end of the story is, I think for probably all of us that are speaking today, is keep your ear to the ground, know things. I would recommend you get a copy of the statute. If you don't have a copy of it, we can send you one. Let Brandy know, give her your business card, and we'll get it to you. But keep your ear to the ground and listen. Stay connected to Ray. Stay connected to SafeX. Stay connected to Working Partners so you can kind of hear how things are changing. I want to talk a little, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of like nuts and bolts in the trenches about the statute. I also want to talk about what we've seen with businesses since we've been dealing with medical marijuana, talk about why this is so hard for employers, and then end with just a couple of considerations that from the School of Hard Knocks of what we should be thinking about. I am not an attorney like Mariah is, so here's all the language saying I ain't one. She is, I'm not one. When we're talking drug-free workplace, you always have to balance the legal with the operational. Like, what's happening in the trenches? How do I really deal and manage this law? So, Brandy said to you that Working Partners has not taken a formal stance and won't in support or in opposition of issue 2. But I thought it would be helpful for you to see who is on each side of the issue, especially from a business perspective. The organization who is leading the proponents is the Coalition to Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol. Those are the officials that are endorsing it, corporations and organizations. The organization that is leading the opposition is the Protect Ohio Workers and Families. When you look at organizations, I don't know who's in manufacturing, but your association, the Ohio Manufacturers Association, has come out in opposition, the Ohio Chamber, etc. So do your homework and read. And if you are in manufacturing and your association says no, find out why they're saying no. Because there are definitely issues on both sides of the issue. Mariah talked a little bit about quantity and potency, but I want to bring it down so that you can understand what does that really mean. First of all, the law says that I can go and I can purchase 2.5 ounces of dry material, like weed, right? If I'm going to purchase at a licensed adult use dispensary, very similar to what we have now with medical dispensaries. So it's going to be a store. The good thing about this is the quality is going to be there. There's not going to be pesticides in it. And I'm going to know exactly what the THC content of it is. I'm going to know what it is because it's regulated. It has to be tested and grown a certain way if I get it in a store. That's different than if it's home grow. I don't know what the home grow is. I don't know what the THC content is. But the law says that I can have on me 2.5 ounces. I'm going, what's that? Well, 2.5 ounces is 70 grams, and a gram gets you about 3 joints. Okay, so we're talking about I can have 210-ish, depends how, about 210 joints on me. That was helpful to me because I don't know what 2.5 ounces is. So that's what the law says. Mariah also says we can grow 6 to 12 in the house. Each person can have 6. Don't know what the THC content is. And don't think that if we can't get ripe tomatoes in the middle of winter, we can grow weed that has very high THC content. People know how to do that, but we don't know what it is. I think we have to talk about potency. Now remember, this is not a constitutional amendment that is locked in stone, right? This is a law. And employers, this is really important for you to know because it's a law, that means a lot of the details will be worked out afterwards. The legislators will work out a lot of the details. So right now it says, we're going to decide later what the potency is going to be, but interestingly it says it can't be less than 90%, 35% for plant material, 35% THC, and that's the active ingredient that gets somebody high, and 90% for extracts. Now an extract is a component of the plant that I can take out that has a very, very high THC content. And typically, when you have an extract, it's in a solid form like hash, you might have heard of. It can be in a liquid form that people vape. It can be in a liquid form called a tincture that people will put in their coffee, under their tongue, etc. And it can also be in edibles, where you combine the extract with food, like a cookie or a gummy bear or that kind of thing, as high as 90%. Now you also go, okay, well, Karen, how potent is 90%? Let me give you a little historical perspective here. I will, first of all, tell you, I got to thinking, I wonder what the THC content was when I was in high school, which was a very long time ago. But I did find out that in the 70s, which is in that era that I graduated, they called it Woodstock weed, was between 1 and 3% THC. Do you hear that? 1 to 3% THC. Okay. There is a group, the University of Mississippi has been charged with getting, when they seize weed on the streets, they analyze it to see how potent it is. So back in 1995, the potency was about 3.96 THC. These days, it's over 15% THC. So if I had somebody that smoked weed in high school and hasn't smoked weed since, it's not the same thing. So that on the streets, it's 15. What did we say an extract could be? 90% THC, 35% if it's a plant material, much higher than the typical weed on the streets. And I think that's significant to understand because like Mariah said, the higher the THC, the greater the chance of addiction, the higher the THC, the more impairment. Okay? Let me tell you a couple things we're seeing in Ohio since we passed medical marijuana and just in general. First of all, we're trying to still get used to the idea of medical marijuana with employers. There's no such thing as a prescription for marijuana. It's not a prescription, it's a recommendation. If it were a prescription, that would make life so much easier for employers because you probably have a rule in your policy that says, here's what you can and can't do with prescriptions. It ain't one because it hasn't been cleared by the FDA. And where the rubber meets the road is if you send somebody for a drug test and they have Valium in the system, if they can prove to the medical review officer that they have a prescription for that, it comes back to you as negative. You don't even know. Protects the employee's rights. A little rough for you that they're out there working with Valium in their system, but it protects the employee's rights. If somebody tests positive for marijuana and it goes to the medical review officer and the medical review officer says, hey, is there a reason for this? And the employee says, yes, I have a card, they still rule it positive. So now you have to decide, am I going to let that person drive a forklift? So we're still trying to figure this out. Employees don't understand their rights. Employers don't understand their rights. The law is very clear. You can accommodate, but you don't have to. Brian just went over that. Employers also don't know who or how to accommodate. If an employer wants to accommodate, they really should only do that for non-safety sensitive employees, which we'll talk about in a second, but for non-safety sensitive. So I might accommodate somebody sitting at a computer, but I wouldn't if they're out working on a machine or up in the air. Does that make sense? Say again?
That'd be great talk, I'd like to hear more.
I'm sorry, so.
Expound on that, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Maybe you plan to.
I will real quick right here. And this really, when we were wrestling with this and talking to our attorney about how to handle this, he said, you know what, we get in a very awkward position if we accommodate people in safety sensitive positions. How we typically define that is safety sensitive functions like driving, working on a ladder, working on equipment, safety sensitive functions. Some of us do those a lot. 75 to 100% of the time we do a safety sensitive function. That would make my position safety sensitive position. Best practice to accommodate people that aren't doing safety sensitive, because if you, for example, do random testing, have a positive test on the books, they've tested positive, but you say, oh, I'm going to accommodate you, and then they go do something safety sensitive and hurt someone, it puts the employer in a very awkward position. So typically, and maybe someday this will change too, and I'll explain why, but it puts an employer in a very awkward position to make those decisions about, is the person okay to work? Are they okay to work? Which, remember that, because that's kind of at the crux of why this is so difficult. Number two thing we're seeing, there's so much confusion about THC and CBD. A little agricultural lesson, the family of marijuana plants is called cannabis. And under that family, there's a marijuana plant and there's a hemp plant. And the marijuana plant has a really high levels of THC and low levels of CBD, and it's the opposite with the hemp plant. Then we have marijuana, there's 300 to 400 components in it. So now we're seeing Delta 8 is the component that gets us high that we know about. Now we're seeing advertisements for Delta 8 and Delta 10, which are just other components, other pieces out of the plant. And the questions are these legal or not? Are they going to show up in a drug test or not? The one I'm getting most calls about right now is Delta 8, because that one's being advertised in stores, because technically, when the Farm Bill passed several years ago, things from the hemp plant were made legal. And Delta 8 is primarily extracted from the hemp plant. But it still has some intoxicating qualities to it. It just is confusing. And then as far as what the expectations are of employers and employees around all these extracts of marijuana. Use is becoming very normalized. Just real quickly, if you take a look at these statistics and you look at this here, people that have used marijuana in the past year. So 12 to 17-year-olds in 2002, I just wanted to give you a perspective, 15.8% of kids 12 to 17 had used in the past year. Look where we are now, the number's gone down. And I think that's because we're doing a much better job with prevention in the schools. But look at 26 plus. 16.3% of working age people have used marijuana in the last year. And it's really grown. Use is becoming normalized. Excuse me. At the same time, we are seeing increasing rates of positives at workplace tests. You can see the climb from 2018 to 2022. Quest Diagnostics, oh, I didn't know if you were interested in what industries are testing positive for marijuana most often. I'll let you look at that just a touch. I put a line under manufacturing and transportation because they're kind of out of order a little bit, but I thought those industries might be of interest. And then when you take a look at some new data that's coming out from Quest Diagnostics, which is probably the leading drug testing organization around, it's alarming that the rate of positive marijuana post-accidents is increasing. Can I say that again? From last year to this year, there was a 9% increase in the number of positive tests after an accident. And in the past 10 years, there's been a 200% increase in the rate of positives after accidents. So my point was it's being normalized. We're seeing more people use, we're seeing more people test positive, which is hard for employers. If you take a look at the impact of legalization, Since last year, the states that have recreational laws, the rate of positives for marijuana increased by 11%. Medical increased, I think, by 8%. Medical states that have medical only. And then states that have no recreation or medical laws on the books, a 3% increase. And finally, many of us are feeling the hiring crunch and are considering changes around their policies. Here's the things that I get asked all the time. Can I just take marijuana out of my policy? I just don't want to deal with it. Or can I at least stop testing for it? Or maybe I'll test for it after an accident, but I don't want to test for it at pre-employment. I don't want to put up that barrier to employment. People will say, well, I found the perfect employee and they told me that they have a card, but I really, really want to hire them. Can I hire them? And finally, well, I don't really care what my employees do in their personal, misspelling, in their personal time. I just want them to be impaired on the job. Will you think about this for a second? Because I get this. I don't care what you do in your personal time. I don't care. I'm your employer. I care what you do when you come on my clock. And when you come here, I don't want you to be under the influence. And that makes sense. But, hang with me. Here's what makes this issue so difficult, I think, for employers. Number one is, it's a very personal and sometimes very emotional issue. I know when I walk into any group like this, I know somebody's mom is probably taking medical marijuana and it has saved her life. My mom has Parkinson's. I often wonder, that's one of the conditions you can get a card for. It's very personal. There are some of us that have used marijuana, adult use, since high school. And we've kept jobs, and our families have been fine, and we haven't had crashes. So some of us are users. Some of us think it's horrible, horrible, horrible. So it's emotional. And when I see employers dealing with it, I'll have a safety director that says, absolutely no, we're not going to accommodate medical marijuana. And then I'll have the hiring manager who says, oh my gosh, we have to, because I can't find people. It is emotional and it's personal. We all have strong feelings about it and probably experiences one way or the other in some way with the drug. It's also very difficult because it's a legal patchwork. It's still illegal at the federal level, remember, right? So for example, if you're regulated by a federal authority, then you have to succumb to that authority. It's also a patchwork from state to state. When Mariah was explaining the employer part of this statute, folks, comparatively to the rest of the country, it is incredibly employer-friendly. There are a lot of state statutes where you're not allowed to test for marijuana pre-employment. Or if somebody tests positive, you can't do anything with a positive result. So if it stays like this, like if the legislators don't mess with it a lot after it becomes law, if it does, it's pretty employer-friendly. But we have to, and if you work in multiple states, you have to make sure your policy it honors both of those states. I know we've got West Virginia room. West Virginia drug testing laws are very different than Ohio drug testing laws. And we can't just say, oh, we have an Ohio policy, wherever the employee's feet are, the rules of that state apply. That's very simplistic. But we have to honor the statutes and the laws in other states. It's also difficult because we have limited research. We know what low-risk alcohol levels are. We have research that says that if you drink within these low-risk levels, or don't drink at all, you have a very small chance of developing the disease of addiction. We don't have that with marijuana, so we don't have the research. And probably the research that we need most, and this is kind of the point, employers, that your life will be hard until this changes, and it will, is we have no way to measure impairment for marijuana. Do you understand me? We have no way to measure impairment. Now, if you do a drug test on somebody, that result is court defensible. It is defensible to say that that substance is in the person's system. But what we don't have is research that correlates what does this amount do to the body? What does this amount do to the body? We have that with alcohol. We know that 0.02 BAC does this to the body. 0.04 does this, 0.08. We have the research. We don't have that research for marijuana. So if somebody tests positive for 50 nanograms of THC per milliliter of urine, that means nothing to me as far as whether they're impaired, which is tough because marijuana is the one that stays in the system for a while. So you have employers that say, he tested positive, but how do I know he didn't use a week ago? You don't. How do I know he didn't use an hour ago? You don't. This will change. This will change. We will do the research and we will come up with a way to test for impairment, but right now it's difficult. What the law says is, you can't use at work, you can't use at work. Okay, I get a little bit nervous with edibles, because am I going to know if somebody uses at work? Is that cookie in their lunchbox cool or not? However you define cool. You know, how do I know? How do I know if I'm going to put a drop in the coffee? How do I know? So they can't use at work, obviously. They can't come to work under the influence. You got to go back to your policies and check to see how you have under the influence defined. You have to define under the influence. And what most people say is, under the influence is a positive test. You test positive, you're under the influence. Now, I will tell you, you better keep watching because most other states have said, oh no, that's not good enough. That's not good enough. We won't accept a positive test as the definition of under the influence. Right now, under the statute, it looks like we're going to. So make sure, take the word impaired out of your policies, put the word under the influence, and define it as a positive test so that you've got some objective measure. Let me close with 5 considerations. How am I doing on time? Okay. Consider, I can do one a minute. I don't know. Here's 2. Number one and 2. First of all, don't make any changes or do anything until you know who governs you. Like, do you have authorities that tell you what you can and can't do around marijuana? Are you subject to the Department of Transportation? Are you subject to the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988? Do you hire professionals like carpenters and who have credentials and their bodies say, oh, you can't accommodate or whatever? So make sure you know who your authorities are. Are you in the Bureau's Drug-Free Safety Program, etc.? Second thing is, please be sure you're thinking about weed in a couple different, I was going to say pots, but that was too, that's not cool. One of them is medical. What are you doing about medical? Are you accommodating? Are you not accommodating? If you are, for whom and how? And the second one is, what are you doing about adult use? Now, you're not going to be able to say, probably, I'm not going to hire you if you're an adult user. But are you going to continue testing the way you currently test? Okay? So you really need to be thinking about both of those things. What's happening? The third one is, I already told you, please be sure you're defining what under the influence is, because again, the statute says employers are allowed to say you can't be under the influence, but if you don't have it defined, it's going to be tough to move on that. The next thing is, please be sure that you define safety sensitivity. When we look across the country at what's happening, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen in Ohio, because remember, it's a law that can be tweaked. So we don't know what's going to happen. So define under the influence and make sure you really look at your positions and identify who's a safety sensitive position, because sometimes that helps govern what your actions are going to be.
Is it based upon position or activity?
Both. We have a safety sensitive activity, driving, the INGs, the verbs, that anybody can do.
Can be differentiated between.
Yeah, 2 lists. But then you say, which positions, we say 75 to 100% of the time do the INGs, do the functions, and they become the positions. Laborer, carpenter, driver, etc. And identifying that and even tying those to their job descriptions, which Rain Associates might talk about, really helps you figure out, are those safety sensitive functions essential to the job when you're trying to make decisions about what to do. And finally, carefully select your testing options. Right now, best practice is urine for drug, breath or blood for alcohol, but those are changing. We're seeing oral fluid testing on the horizon. There's a new breath test for marijuana that's being advertised, and it's all about what the window of detection is. And if you do a hair test, you can look back months in somebody's past. If you do a urine test, maybe days, weeks. You do oral fluid, probably 5 to 48 hours that you can see what the use is. And breath testing, they're saying, has a window of detection of only 3 hours. But be careful because those are changing, and you want to be sure you're using best practice gold shelf testing in case there's some kind of a contest. So I won't say anything more than that. I think Katie's going to talk a little bit more about that. And finally, please know that there are options as far as how you do your policies, depending on what your objectives are, when you're going to test, how you're going to test, who you're going to test, what you're going to test for. When you write your policy, you can monkey around with these things to make sure that your hiring, productivity, safety objectives are all met. Finally, 5 things. I'm going to tee things up for Katie, who's going to be talking next, and that is really, no matter what the terrain is, no matter what the drug is, no matter what the law is, employers, you should be doing 5 things. You should have a good drug-free workplace policy with operations, not just the don't do it, but how does it operationalize? You need to be doing employee education and supervisor training, testing in whatever dose seems right for you. You don't have to do pre-employment. You don't have to do random. I would for sure have those post-accident reasonable suspicion reactive types. And please, 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 I'll end with this, have a plan for assistance. You don't have to pay for it necessarily, but know what you're going to do if somebody comes forward and says, I need help. We may see more of that in the future, and be ready. Employers can make more impact than families, I think, in helping people get help. Are we there?
We're there. We're there.
Awesome.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. For those of you that stick around for the next session, I promise I'm going to get it together next time. But we're going to go ahead and take 10 minutes. You can cut just 5 minutes. I'm getting 5 minutes to go to the next session, or you can stick around for the next one that we're going to have Rain Associates and SafeX talking. Okay. Thank you.